Now, before we jump into this lecture and the next one on Athens and the golden age of Pericles, I feel obliged to point out that this material would actually support a much longer treatment, like actually its own course. Fortunately for you, there is one. If you wish to know more after these lectures, I encourage you to check out Jeremy McInerney's course, The Age of Pericles. Now, Athens is familiar to most of us as the birthplace of democracy, tragic and comic theater, philosophy, classical art, history, and really so much of our own culture. Most of those contributions reached their peak in the 5th century BC phase of the city called its Golden Age. The impact of this unique culture is frankly hard to quantify. But for the past 2,500 years, the achievements of this period in Athens have inspired and challenged us to fulfill Athens' ideals and to extend its contributions to future generations. We value what the Athenians did, and so looking back on this period is always a useful exercise in reflecting on ourselves as well as on them. And I would like to point out that it's not just us. The notion of Athens as a golden age in the 5th century BC doesn't come from modern times. It started in the 1st century AD with the Romans. The Roman Emperor Augustus and great Roman Admiral Pliny the Elder both looked back at the 5th century BC as a true golden age and tried to make connections between their own values and their own culture and Athens of the 5th century BC. So we're actually in pretty good company. Well, since Athens had a Mycenaean community prior to that civilization's collapse in 1200 BC, it stands between the previous lecture on Mycenae and the next lecture on Miletus, which, like Athens, was destroyed by the Persians in the Great Persian Wars of the 490s and 480s BC. The Athens we'll look at, first in public buildings and then domestic space, is a product of the building campaign that followed the Persian destruction. Since Athens has been continually occupied since antiquity, and despite my repeated requests everyone hasn't left, archaeology is restricted to a few key areas in the city. For the public spaces, that means the buildings on the Acropolis, along the slopes of the Acropolis, and in and around the Agora, the public square, which is on the north side of the Acropolis below it, in a lower area. These were but a fraction of the entire city at the time. But the core of the public buildings and spaces for the city, in which about 120,000 people of all classes may have lived at the time of the death of Pericles in 429 BC. Now, having just given you that number, I'm going to tear it apart. Because in a previous lecture, I said that Athens at this time consisted of about 1 square mile of city. And I just gave you about 120,000 people. That, if that were actually the case, would make Athens over twice as dense in population as any city in the United States in the first decades of the 21st century. I don't think that's the case. What I think this reveals is a couple of things. First off, these numbers that we have about populations are more or less guesses. I think they're informed guesses, but they're guesses. When trying to figure out the overall population of a city in the ancient world, and therefore the population density, there's just so many variables. It's almost impossible to come up with the same number twice, and well, to come up with an accurate count. And so I wanted to point that out. So when I say 120,000 people here, I don't want you to think of 120,000 people all crammed into that square mile of the city of Athens. I want you to think of 120,000 Athenian citizens spread throughout the province of Attica. That is, all of the area controlled by the city of Athens in its great city-state. These are the people that made the city of Athens, but they don't necessarily all live there. So I just wanted to make that clear. Well, thanks to the development of Athens' radical democracy, in which almost all public offices were popularly elected, it experienced an otherwise unprecedented intervention of politicians into all aspects of public life. This conclusion is supported by one very intriguing, if not terribly visual, piece of evidence: ostraca. We looked at ostraca already. We encountered them at Deir el-Medina. Ostraca were the broken or cast-off pieces of pottery that were used in the ancient world as scratch pads. Pottery, once you have a pot and you break it, you have broken pottery. You can't do anything else with it. It's always going to be pottery. And so what you have are semi-permanent pieces of solid material that make a handy place to scratch or paint on. In political terms, ostraca were a handy object on which to scratch or paint the name of an Athenian citizen who a voter wanted to be banished from the city for a 10-year period. This remarkable process, which as far as we can tell is unique to the radical democracy of Athens, is known from the ostraca as ostracism. Ostracism is the annual vote in the agora that was taken to determine who, if anyone, would be banished from the city. It was actually two phases of votes. They had a popular vote to see if anybody reached the necessary minimum threshold, and then a second vote to see who would be exiled for 10 years. Thousands and thousands of these ostraca have been excavated from the Athenian agora, and on them we can read the names of every prominent politician of the 5th century BC, including Themistocles, the man most responsible for the victory over the Persians, and Pericles himself. I should tell you, or remind you, that this is the period of the radical democracy, where almost every major office is elected, and so really, every officer has the opportunity to alienate part of the electorate. And so all of these elected officials find themselves in hot water at one time or another. I think, interestingly enough, there's one major exception to the radical democracy. Not, as you might expect, the military, because generals were elected as well. It was the water commissioner. The water commissioner was the only office in Athens in the 5th century BC, the only major office that was not popularly elected. It was the only place where they decided they really needed an expert. I think that's fascinating. Not running the military or running government, that's all volunteer work. It's the water commissioner. That's where you can tell real priorities are. Well, in any event, the agora itself, Athens Public Square, has very little architectural form. But the ostraca give us testimony as to its use as the political heart of the city. Although there's almost nothing to see, because it was a large open area for voters to gather to cast ballots, the finds demonstrate the vibrant democracy and critical civic role of the space. Because of the changes in the democracy that took place in the 5th century, it is called the radical democracy. Eventually, virtually every act of government and every civil and military office was elected by the people at large, called in Greek the demos. An extraordinarily well-preserved marble relief from Athens at this period shows Athena herself crowning the personified demos, effectively pointing out or passing on the authority of it as the supreme power in the state. We see remarkably the demos seated in a chair which looks like a throne, being crowned by the goddess Athena. There's no better visual statement of the power of the people, I think, than that. Well, given that revised form of government, the agora was renovated to make spaces for government offices and councils. The open area of the agora in this period of the 5th century was cleared of houses to allow for large political gatherings, while buildings for various branches of the new democratic government were constructed along the western edge of the agora. The agora, the civic center of Athens, was originally a broad open area where several major roads converged and met from across the city. In the 5th century BC, after that, it was gradually formalized. First off, it was defined by a series of stone pillars, of stelae, that were placed out to mark the boundaries. These boundaries were important to the Athenians because the agora was actually restricted community space. It's the political heart of the city, and so actually only adult men were allowed in there. Young men, boys who had not yet come of age, were forbidden from the agora, and we know that from the inscriptions on some of these pillars. So the first step, mark out the boundaries. The second step, formalize it and make sure it stays the province of elite men. Secondly, it was developed with new buildings. The buildings are the same categories we would look for in a modern small city downtown. If you walked around the downtown of a small American city, you would find entertainment buildings, commercial buildings, religious, civic, legislative, and judicial spaces. All of these are fairly common, I think. Well, in place of our courthouses, churches, strip malls, monuments, and government office buildings, the Athenians had their own building forms that were very different. Temples instead of churches, and enclosed altars for sacrifices. All areas for having religious rituals occur outdoors rather than inside, for example. They had their own forms of buildings that are different than ours, except for that strip mall. Interestingly enough, the strip mall is almost identical to the Greek stoa. The long shed with a colonnade across the front and a solid back and sides. This form began as a covered walkway and developed later into a deeper structure to house a row of shops behind. So you'd have a covered sidewalk effectively in front and a line of shops behind. These stoas were used in cities in a number of ways, and we'll discuss these more at length in the next lecture on Miletus. But I wanted you to know that the notion of the strip mall actually comes from the ancient Greek world, and we find it in the golden age of Pericles, which might give you, I don't know, some pause and make you reconsider the greatness of the lowly strip mall. Well, in the southeast corner of the Agora, it was anchored by a large, long fountain house. This was a public fountain house about 60 feet or 18 meters long, and it contained large basins of water with spouts for filling water jugs. The water ran constantly, fed by pipes that brought the supply from outside the city. It's gravity fed, of course, like most ancient water systems, and getting it to run constantly was not the problem. Trying to stop it was. And so once you get that water gravity fed running into the city, you just have to keep it flowing. And it did here in the fountain house of the Agora. While most of the houses in Athens had their own wells or cisterns, that is, cisterns that were collecting water, rainwater that came off the roof, or their own small wells, those could go dry in the hottest parts of the year, whereas the fountain house did not. One of my duties as a graduate student in a small village in Greece was to carry water for my professor every day from the public fountain for her house, and for all of the domestic purposes, everything in the bathroom and the kitchen. And I got a real appreciation of what it was like to carry water from a public fountain at that time. I like indoor plumbing, just say that. Well, as in many of our cities, civic buildings were grouped together in the Agora, and their use and their form tell us about the governing in the city. A characteristic building that we find here, as well as in other Greek cities, is the bouleuterion. This is the headquarters for the boule. The boule is a body of about, well, in this case, exactly 500 men. At Athens, under the radical democracy, they are selected at random, and they would hold office for a year. This is the body that's responsible for calling the great public assembly and for being themselves on duty at all time. No fewer than 17 at a time in their headquarters, the bouleuterion, on the west side of the Agora. 24 hours a day for government emergencies. So the bouleuterion is a space for these guys to meet, for them to sleep, for at least 17 of them to be here at all times, so that at any time, day or night, when somebody needed government, they could come here. I think that's a wonderful idea. Well, in addition to a number of altars, which we find scattered throughout the Agora, a temple was constructed on a hill overlooking the Agora on its west side, which visually dominated the area and defined, I think, the religious character of the Agora. The temple was dedicated to Hephaestus, the patron god of craftsmen, and as part of this 5th century building boom in Athens. The choice of deity might have been based on the location of a sculpture casting workshop on the slope below it, right on the edge of the Agora, prior to the building of the temple. The placement of an industrial facility on the Agora might strike us as surprising, as we typically wouldn't zone part of our city square for an industrial foundation. But in the ancient world, mixed use was the order of the day, and zoning laws were largely non-existent. So we have a range of activities, domestic as well as civic and industrial, all around this key public area. The centerpiece of the Periclean building program was the extensive rebuilding of the monuments on the Acropolis to replace all of the archaic ones that had been destroyed in the Persian sack of Athens during Persia's great invasion of Greece in 480 BC. The Athenians vowed not to rebuild until the Persians were removed from all Greek territory. So actually a generation passed before the monumental rebuilding on the Acropolis. This program was a radical reinvention of the spaces and buildings for the religious cults on the Acropolis, including the new Parthenon, the most visionary and radical of all Doric temples. The religious domination of the Acropolis differs from the Mycenaean emphasis on the Megaron, the royal palace space at the highest level of the city. It has more in common with the space given to religion at Knossos, in that broad western court, or at Uruk, with the high ziggurats and temple platforms, where religious complexes and spaces dominated really the entire city, particularly on the highest ground in each one. Here at Athens, the religious identity of the community was linked to its democratic government in the major 5th century BC building program. The first component of this program was the Propylaea by the architect Menisocles. Was constructed from 437 to 432 BC. And again, the buildings up here were burned in 480. So it was only after the Persians were chased out of all Greek territory that they came back and started building here. Really quite a long time afterwards. The Propylaea is a formal entryway onto the Acropolis, placed just at the head of the ramp before one reached the open area of the Acropolis itself. The central portion is a very elaborate version of a propylon, literally in Greek, that which is in front of the gate. But it was more than that. It had great wings of spaces to the north and south. The north wing provided an area for the display of panel paintings, that is, Greek paintings by what were then, even then, the old masters. These are paintings on wooden panels that are hung on easels or on the wall, and here for the entire community to enjoy. It also might have been used for dining by exclusive groups on special occasions, such as religious festivals. Scholars call this the Pinakotheca, that is, the picture gallery, because of the paintings. It housed a number of famous paintings which survive only in descriptions by the Greek author Pausanias. Otherwise, we don't have any of them. The south wing allowed access to the precinct of Athena Nike. Adjacent to the Propylaea, on that south side, was this very small sanctuary of Athena Nike, Athena of Victory, built in the 420s BC. It's a beautiful little jewel box of a temple in the Ionic order. And this is significant because the Ionic is the decorative style from Ionia, East Greece, what today is Western Turkey, the area of Miletus. This style, Ionic, is characterized by long bands of relief decoration. This new sanctuary commemorating Athenian military victory was built not really on the Acropolis. It's built out on a projecting bastion off the very edge of the Acropolis. So they expanded the area on top in order to fit in this sanctuary to Athena Nike. The most complex and ritually significant but architecturally difficult building was the Erechtheion, also designed by Menisocles and built between 420 and 405 BC. The site was very irregular, sloping dramatically down the face of the Acropolis. It's all solid rock, so they're building here on very irregular projecting rock shelf with major changes in elevation. So the building needed to incorporate at least 3 separate cult sites under this very irregular floor plan. The name Erechtheion means building of Erechtheus. Now, Erechtheus was a legendary king of Athens who was buried and, in fact, might have been born here on the Acropolis. In addition to hosting a cult site to Erechtheus, the building is also said to be sacred to Poseidon. It preserves the marks of his trident on the bedrock here on the Acropolis. It was also sacred to Athena, the patron deity of Athens, because it marks the spot where these two gods, Poseidon and Athena, were said to have competed to be that patron deity. And so the three components of the building recognize the three important cults and mythical events that occurred on this spot. Like the Temple of Athena Nike, it was designed in a decorative Ionian style, with Ionic capitals and female figurines, the caryatids, supporting the roof of a porch in place of columns. One of the most remarkable things about the Periclean construction on the Acropolis is not the buildings themselves, although those are pretty nice. It's that some of the construction records still exist. Since it was a publicly financed project, there were records. They kept documents of everything. We knew from literary accounts that the architects of the Parthenon were Ictinus and Callicrates, and that the main sculptor was Phidias. But the construction accounts of the building give evidence of the status of architects in ancient Athens. They were paid a drachma a day, the same as skilled stonecutters. And so architects were considered to be skilled laborers rather than really any sort of educated elite. One surviving inscription preserves the approval for the design of the Parthenon, really the crown jewel of the entire building program. The Parthenon is an absolutely unique building in Greek architectural history. If I said that phrase right there, that line right there in front of my daughter, she would lecture me on putting a modifier in front of unique. She would say unique means one of a kind. Something can't be absolutely or almost unique. Well, in this case, she's wrong. It's absolutely unique. It's an extraordinary building. What we have in the Parthenon is a Doric temple, characterized by columns with smooth, undecorated capitals and a sculptural frieze of rectangular panels all the way around the exterior. These rectangular panels are called metopes. These, on a Doric temple, take the place of what on an Ionic temple would be a long, continuous sculptural frieze. So a Doric temple with the smooth capitals has discrete or distinct rectangular sculptural panels all the way around the outside, as opposed to a more decorative Ionic temple, which has an exterior frieze that's continuous. Now, the Parthenon was unprecedented in many ways, including size. The facades are 8 columns wide rather than the standard 6. Along its base, it measured about 69.5 meters by about 30 meters, or 228 by about 101.5 feet. The exterior Doric columns are about 10.4 meters, or just over 34 feet high. In addition, it has subtle refinements to adjust the building to fulfill visual expectations. That is, to make the temple look consistently level, counteracting an optical illusion for the ends of the temple to appear lower, where you have the weight of those columns, the visual weight. On the ends, the temple seems to slope downward. This is, again, an optical illusion. So what we have instead is the surrounding steps have an upward curvature of about 60 millimeters. That's about 2.36 inches on the east and west sides, and about 110 millimeters, or 4.33 inches, on the long sides. This is to counteract that notion of that visual illusion. The most innovative component of the Parthenon was the inclusion of an Ionic continuous frieze on a Doric temple for the very first time. This unprecedented decorative element was the longest relief sculpture ever carved in ancient Greece, not just up to that time, but ever. Carved along the exterior of the cella, that is the room inside the Parthenon that held the cult statue, it was about 160 meters in length and just about 1 meter in height. So a continuous frieze of 160 meters long wrapped all the way around the cella building and 1 meter tall. The subject of this frieze is a procession composed of 2 long streams of figures, 70% of which is a cavalcade led by chariots that start in the southwest corner of the building and culminate over the main door on the center of the middle of the east end. The subject of this relief, or this procession, for centuries has been taken as a visual record of the grand Pan-Athenaic procession, the quadrennial procession of worship of Athena that culminated on the Acropolis. Some scholars, in fact, see it as a historical record of the first Pan-Athenaic procession held after the Persian War. But that interpretation has always suffered great problems. Many of the key elements known to be part of that procession are not pictured here. Also, that subject is human and historic. It's not divine or mythical activity, making it inappropriate for a temple and completely unknown in Greek religious architecture. It doesn't solve the problem of the name of the building either, Parthenon, building of the young girl or young girls. In 1993, however, a mythological interpretation was proposed by Joan Breton Connolly, who argued that the scene, the Parthenon frieze, the Great Procession, was a myth of the sacrifice of the daughters of King Erechtheus, in fulfillment of a vow, in order to save the city of Athens from foreign attack. Thus, it was a mythological metaphor for the Athenian victory, or for the sacrifices that made the Athenian victory possible over the Persians. And it does so, it celebrates the victory over the Persians in a mythological way without violating the prohibition of contemporary human figures on Greek temples. It also explains the name of the building, Parthenon, building of young girls, because those young daughters of Erechtheus gave their lives for Athens. Now, perhaps the most visually stunning part of the entire program was the statue of Athena Parthenos in the cella of the Parthenon. This statue of the patron deity of Athens was sculpted by Phidias himself, and it's chryselephantine. That is, it's constructed out of gold and ivory. Well, it's not really constructed out of gold and ivory. What we have is, in fact, a wooden framework, which is built up and then covered with gold and ivory. That is a spectacular, colossal work of sculpture, about 40 feet tall, covered with about 2,400 pounds of gold where the drapery would be, and ivory where Athena's skin would show, mainly the face and hands. This statue stood in the temple for about 1,000 years until it was removed and taken to the new Roman capital at Constantinople. The original statue of Athena Parthenos no longer survives, but small-scale copies of it have, so we're certain of its form. Not only do we have these small-scale copies from antiquity, but I would be remiss if I didn't give a plug to the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. If you haven't had a chance, you've got to go and see this. It's amazing. It is, in fact, as close as they can get to a duplicate of the Athenian Parthenon. Same size, same scale, everything. And inside is the great statue of Athena Parthenos, which they have gilded. All of the drapery is covered with gold. It's really an extraordinary thing. And if you get a chance at all, if you're anywhere around Nashville, Tennessee, go see the Parthenon. It's completely worth it, I promise. Okay? Thanks. Well, the public buildings and spaces of 5th century BC Athens were created in the aftermath of the destruction of the Persian War as a celebration of Athenian identity. They exist in the form they do because of the needs and processes of Athenian democracy and religion. The Athenian people benefited both directly and indirectly from the new public form of their city. And this form of the city has shaped many later cities, including Rome, Paris, Washington, D.C., and St. Petersburg. In the next lecture, we'll look into the domestic spaces of some of these Athenians and see how those who created these images and supported the democracy actually lived in it.